Did you know the song Elvis sang to a real dog on national television was not his choice, but a compromise to make him seem safe? Or that a major TV network's board of directors held an emergency meeting to discuss a singer's hip movements? What if the most censored musical performance in history, the one filmed only from the waist up, was actually the one that sold the most records and cemented a legend? These moments were not accidents. They were collisions. They were the flashpoints where an old, established America first saw its future on a small, flickering screen. And that screen, and what we watch on it, was never the same after a young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, sang a song called Hound Dog. Number 15, why did they film him from the waist up? Ed Sullivan swore he would never have Elvis Presley on his show. He called him unfit for a family audience. This was in June 1956. The country's top television host, the man who ran the Really Big Shoe, put his foot down. But by September, Elvis was on that very stage. Sullivan did not just change his mind. The world changed it for him. The first fact is the money. Sullivan offered Elvis $5,000. Other shows offered more. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, turned them all down. He wanted Sullivan. He knew that Sullivan's Sunday night show was the seal of approval in American entertainment. He eventually got a contract for 3 appearances for the unheard of sum of $50,000. That was more than any performer had ever been paid for a variety show appearance. The second fact is that Ed Sullivan was not even there for Elvis's first performance on his show on September 9th, 1956. He was recovering from a car accident. The actor Charles Laughton hosted instead, but the show was still Sullivan's, and the rules were his. For that first show, Elvis was shown head to toe. He sang Don't Be Cruel, Love Me Tender, and Ready Teddy. He also sang a bit of Hound Dog. The camera showed everything, the leg shake, the swiveling hips, the energy that made teenagers scream and parents write letters, and the ratings were staggering. The show captured an 82.6% share of the television audience. That means more than 4 out of every 5 television sets in use in the United States were tuned to Elvis. Around 60 million people watched. The scale of that is hard to grasp today. It was a national event. The controversy that had been simmering since his performance on Milton Berle's show a few months earlier exploded. The press was brutal, but the ratings did not lie. People were watching. So, for his second appearance on October 28th, Sullivan was back. He was nervous. He had seen the letters. He had heard from the sponsors. He tried to control the situation. He stood on stage and personally vouched for Elvis. He told the audience, I want to say to Elvis Presley and the country that this is a real decent fine boy. It was a calculated move to calm down the adults in the room, but when Elvis performed, the cameras still pulled back. They showed him, but they were careful. They used more close-ups on his face. They cut away to the audience. They were learning how to manage the phenomenon. The famous Waist Up broadcast was the third and final one on January 6th, 1957. By this point, the moral panic was at its peak. Sullivan and his producers made a decision. They would present Elvis, but they would censor his body. For his performances of Hound Dog and Heartbreak Hotel, the cameras were instructed to show him only from the waist up. This was not a subtle choice. It was a direct response to public pressure. It was the television establishment trying to put a lid on a volcano. But it had the opposite effect. The act of censorship made the performance even more powerful. Every teenager watching knew exactly what they were not being allowed to see. The forbidden movements became more legendary in their absence. The camera would show Elvis's face contorted with energy and emotion, and the audience's imagination filled in the rest. The censorship did not tame Elvis. It made him a martyr for a new kind of expression. It drew a clear line in the sand. On one side were the adults, the censors, the people trying to control what you saw. On the other side was Elvis, and, by extension, the entire youth generation. The waist-up shot was meant to be an act of containment. Instead, it became an act of amplification. And it turned a television performance into a cultural statement. It demonstrated that what a camera chooses not to show can be just as important and just as influential as what it shows. Television was no longer just a window into a performance. It was a participant, a filter, a censor. And that changed the relationship between the viewer and the screen forever. Number 14, could a single TV show create a national scandal? On June 5th, 1956, Elvis Presley appeared on the Milton Berle Show. He was not a total unknown. He had been on television before on shows hosted by the Dorsey brothers. But those were smaller. Berle's show was different. It was prime time. It was NBC. Milton Berle was Mr. Television, one of the biggest stars in the country. Before this night, the controversy around Elvis was mostly regional, a few grumbles here and there. After this night, it was a national firestorm. The performance itself lasted only a couple of minutes. The song was Hound Dog. Elvis had been performing it on tour, but he had not recorded it yet. He came out on stage without his guitar, which was unusual for him. Berle had reportedly advised him to leave it backstage. He wanted the audience to see Elvis, all of him. Elvis started the song at a frantic pace. Then, about 2/3 of the way through, the band slowed it down to a grinding, bluesy tempo. This was the moment Elvis dug in. He swiveled his hips. He gyrated. He moved in a way that had never been seen on a national television broadcast. The studio audience of teenagers went wild. They screamed, they cried, but the rest of the country, the millions of adults watching at home, had a very different reaction. The day after the show, the backlash began. It was swift and brutal. Television critics who were seen as cultural gatekeepers were horrified. John Crosby of the New York Herald Tribune wrote that Elvis was an unutterable bore, and that his movements were like a striptease with clothes on. Ben Gross of the New York Daily News called the performance suggestive and vulgar. He wrote that it was timed with the kind of animalism that should be confined to dives and brothels. The letters poured into NBC, thousands of them. They came from parents, from teachers, from church leaders. They all said the same thing. Elvis Presley was a menace. He was corrupting the youth of America. The Catholic Church's weekly newspaper, The Tidings, ran an editorial titled "Beware of Elvis Presley." It warned that he was a danger to the spiritual well-being of teenagers. The scandal was not just in the newspapers. It was discussed in homes, in schools, and in workplaces. It was a genuine moral panic. People were truly afraid of what this one television performance represented. They saw it as a breakdown of traditional values. This reaction revealed something new about television. Before this, television was considered a safe, family-friendly medium. It brought sitcoms and variety acts into the living room. It was comforting. The Berle performance shattered that illusion. It showed that television could also be a pipeline for something disruptive, something challenging, something from outside the mainstream. It could bring a raw, untamed energy right into the heart of the American home. The networks were caught completely off guard. They had never dealt with a controversy of this magnitude. They were used to complaints about a low neckline on a dress, not a full-blown cultural war. The scandal forced them to confront a new reality. A single musical performance on a single show could ignite a national debate. It could polarize the country. It could make the medium of television itself seem dangerous. And once that door was opened, it could never be closed again. The age of safe, predictable television was over. Number 13, how did one man make TV seem dangerous? And television in the mid-1950s was a carefully controlled environment. Shows were scripted, rehearsed, and blocked. Every camera movement, every actor's position was planned in advance. The goal was to deliver a smooth, professional, and above all, predictable product. Live television was the standard, which made this control even more important. There was no room for error. There was no room for surprises. Then Elvis Presley walked onto the set of the Milton Berle Show. He was not an actor playing a part. He was not a comedian telling rehearsed jokes. He was a force of nature, and he was unpredictable. His danger was not in what he said. He was famously polite, calling everyone "Sir" and "Mom." The danger was in his physicality. When he performed Hound Dog, he was not just singing a song. He was channeling an energy that the television cameras and the people behind them did not know how to handle. Directors were used to performers who stood still at the microphone or who moved in choreographed, predictable patterns. Elvis moved with an uninhibited, almost chaotic energy. He would lurch, he would jerk, he would shake. The camera operators struggled to keep him in frame. He would move out of his designated spot, away from the optimal lighting. He was breaking all the rules of television performance. This unpredictability was terrifying to the television establishment. It represented a loss of control. They could not package Elvis. They could not sanitize him. He was raw, and that rawness was transmitted directly into millions of homes. This was a new kind of television experience. It was not passive entertainment. It was an event. It was something you had to react to. You either loved it or you hated it, but you could not ignore it. This sense of danger was amplified by the technology of the time. In 1956, television was still a novelty for many families. It was this new piece of furniture in the living room. People trusted it. It brought them the news. It brought them comedy shows. It brought them the world. But it was a world curated by the networks. Elvis was an uncurated element. He felt real in a way that other television performers did not. This created a fundamental shift in the perception of the medium. Television was no longer just a box that showed you pleasant pictures. It was a portal. And you never knew what might come through it. It could bring a sneering, hip-shaking singer from Mississippi who seemed to threaten the very foundations of polite society. It could create a connection between a performer and a young audience that parents did not understand and could not control. The danger of Elvis on television was the danger of the unknown. It was the fear that this new technology was more powerful than anyone had realized. It could not just entertain, it could influence. It could not just reflect culture, it could create it. The performance of Hound Dog made television feel wild for the first time. It made the medium itself part of the story, a character with its own unpredictable power. And that made watching television a much more dynamic and for some a much more frightening experience. Number 12 was humiliating Elvis a strategy. After the firestorm of the Milton Berle performance, the television world was on high alert. So when Elvis was booked to appear on the Steve Allen Show on July 1st, 1956, the host had a plan. Steve Allen was a different kind of television personality than Milton Berle. He was an intellectual, a jazz purist, a comedian known for his clever, low-key style. He was not a fan of rock and roll. He considered it silly and unsophisticated. His plan was not to ban Elvis, but to tame him. He wanted to present a new Elvis, one that was safe for family consumption. It was a deliberate strategy to neutralize the threat. The humiliation was carefully staged. First, Allen made Elvis participate in a corny comedy sketch with himself and the actress Imogene Coca. Elvis was a good sport, but he was clearly out of his element. It was a way of showing the audience that this supposed rebel was just another entertainer willing to play the clown for a paycheck. But the main event was the performance of Hound Dog. Allen came out and explained that he was presenting a new Elvis Presley. The curtain rose, and there was Elvis dressed in a full tuxedo. The rock and roll clothes were gone. The rebellious image was replaced with one of formal conformity, and then came the dog. As Elvis began to sing, a real basset hound wearing a top hat was brought out on stage, and Elvis was instructed to sing Hound Dog to the dog. The song, which on the Berle Show had been a primal scream of energy, was now a joke. Elvis could not move. He could not gyrate. He was trapped in the tuxedo, forced to serenade a sad-looking dog. He did it. He got through the performance looking embarrassed and constrained. He gave a weak smile at the end. The studio audience applauded politely. Steve Allen had won. He had successfully defanged Elvis. He had shown the world that this supposed danger could be controlled, mocked, and made silly. Or so he thought. The broadcast was a massive ratings success. Allen's show beat his rival, Ed Sullivan, for the first time ever. In the short term, the strategy worked. It calmed the nerves of sponsors and network executives, but in the long run, it was a massive miscalculation. Elvis's fans were furious. They saw the performance for, what it was, a deliberate attempt to humiliate their hero. They flooded NBC with angry letters. They felt that the adult world represented by Steve Allen was trying to crush the one thing that spoke to them. This act of condescension did not push them away from Elvis. It pulled them closer. It made them feel protective of him. He was not just a singer anymore. He was one of them, fighting against a world that did not understand. And Elvis himself hated the performance. He later said it was the most ridiculous experience of his career. He felt he had compromised himself. The experience hardened his resolve. He vowed to never let himself be put in that position again. The Steve Allen Show was meant to be the end of the dangerous Elvis. Instead, it was a crucial turning point. It showed Colonel Parker and Elvis the power of their brand. It demonstrated that attempts to control or sanitize Elvis would only make his core audience more loyal. It was a lesson in reverse psychology. By trying to make Elvis safe, Steve Allen accidentally made him an even more potent symbol of rebellion. He had tried to make a joke out of Elvis, but in the end, the joke was on him. Number 11, who really controlled the camera. In 1956, the television director was an absolute monarch. In the chaos of a live broadcast, the director sat in a control booth calling out commands. Ready, camera 1. Take 1. Ready, camera 2. Pan left. The performers on the stage were chess pieces. They hit their marks. They stood in the light. They followed the blocking they had been given in rehearsal. The camera, a massive wheeled machine that weighed over 100 pounds, was the director's tool for capturing this controlled reality. This system had worked for years. It was how television was made. Then Elvis came along and broke the system. When Elvis performed Hound Dog on The Burl Show, he did not stay on his mark. He did not move in predictable ways. He moved with the music. The energy that coursed through him was spontaneous. For the camera operators, this was a nightmare. A typical shot of a singer would be a medium shot, from the waist up, holding them steady in the frame. But how do you hold Elvis steady? How do you frame a man who is constantly in motion, whose legs are shaking, whose body is twisting? The standard vocabulary of television cinematography was not equipped for this. The directors and camera operators had to improvise. They started to move the cameras more. They panned and tilted to follow the action. They used more close-ups to capture the raw emotion on his face, the famous curled lip. They cut more quickly between different camera angles to try and convey a sense of the energy in the room. In doing so, they were accidentally inventing a new way of filming live music. Before Elvis, the camera was a passive observer. It recorded the performance. With Elvis, the camera had to become a participant. It had to dance with him. This created a power struggle in the studio. Elvis was not intentionally being difficult. He was just performing in the only way he knew how. But his natural style was a direct challenge to the director's control. He was leading the dance, and the cameras were forced to follow. This shift was subtle to the home viewer, but it was revolutionary within the industry. It suggested that the performer's energy could dictate the technical presentation of the show, not the other way around. This became even more apparent during the Ed Sullivan shows. When the waist-up order came down for the third show, it was a desperate attempt by the establishment to regain control of the camera. The director's job was no longer to capture the performance, but to actively hide part of it. This act of censorship highlighted the new power of the camera. It was not just a recording device, it was a framing device. It could include and it could exclude. It could define what the audience was allowed to see. By forcing this decision, Elvis's performance had exposed the inherent power dynamics of the television medium. He had forced the men in the control booth to show their hand. After Elvis, musical performers on television were shot differently. The camera became more dynamic, more engaged. It tried to capture the feeling of a live concert, not just the image of a singer. And it all started because one man refused to stand still. He made the camera learn a new language. Number 10. Did TV accidentally invent the generation gap? Before 1956, the concept of a generation gap was not part of the common vocabulary. Of course, parents and children had always had their disagreements. But the idea of a fundamental, unbridgeable divide in taste, values, and culture between a younger generation and their parents was not a mainstream idea. Television, the great unifier of the American family played a big role in this sense of shared culture. The families gathered together to watch I Love Lucy or The Ed Sullivan Show. They shared the experience. It was a common ground. The Elvis Hound Dog performances, particularly on the Burl Show, turned that common ground into a battleground. When families sat down to watch Milton Berle on that Tuesday night, they were not prepared for what they were about to see. When Elvis started his slow, grinding version of Hound Dog, the reaction in living rooms across America was instantaneous and deeply divided. For the teenagers, it was a moment of revelation. Here was something that was theirs. It was not their parents' music. It was not safe or polite. It was energetic, rebellious, and exciting. They felt a connection to the man on the screen. He was one of them. The screams of the young women in the studio audience were echoed by a jolt of recognition in teenage viewers everywhere. For the parents, the reaction was often confusion, followed by anger and fear. They saw the movements as vulgar. They heard the music as noise. They looked at their children's enraptured faces and saw a stranger. They did not understand the appeal. And what people do not understand, they often fear. This was not just a disagreement over a musical performance. It felt much deeper. It was a clash of values. The parents' generation valued conformity, restraint, and respect for authority. Elvis, in those 2 minutes on screen, seemed to reject all of that. He represented a new kind of individualism, a freedom of expression that was physical and emotional, not just intellectual. Television became the medium through which this gap was exposed and widened. The newspaper and magazine articles that followed the performance amplified the divide. Of critics who were all from the older generation wrote scathing reviews, but record sales for other Elvis songs soared, driven by teenage buyers. Letters to the editor pages became forums for this intergenerational debate. Parents wrote in to express their disgust. Teenagers wrote in to defend their hero. For the first time, a national conversation was happening, and it was split almost perfectly along generational lines. The Hound Dog performance did not create the tensions that led to the generation gap. Those were already brewing under the surface of post-war American society. But the performance acted as a catalyst. It brought those tensions out into the open, into the living room. It gave the younger generation a face and a voice, and it showed the older generation exactly what they were up against. The television, which had been a symbol of family togetherness, was now broadcasting a declaration of independence from a new generation. It was a powerful and unsettling moment. The shared experience of television was fractured. And in that fracture, the modern concept of the generation gap was born. Number 9, how do you sell 1 million? Records in a week. In the music business of the 1950s, selling 1 million copies of a single was a massive achievement. It was the mark of a true superstar. It was a process that usually took months of radio play, jukebox saturation, and touring. The idea of selling 1 million records in a week was almost unthinkable. But Elvis Presley's Hound Dog did not follow the old rules, and television was the reason why. A crucial fact is often overlooked. When Elvis performed Hound Dog on the Milton Berle Show in June and the Steve Allen Show in July, the record had not been released yet. He was performing a song that the public could not buy. This was not an accident. It was a brilliant, if perhaps unintentional, marketing strategy. The television performances acted as massive, nationwide commercials for a product that was not yet available. They built up an incredible amount of demand. After the Berle performance, teenagers were buzzing about the song. After the Allen performance, where he was humiliated, his fans were even more determined to support him. They were all waiting for the official version to be released. RCA, Elvis's record label, knew they had something huge on their hands. They pressed an unprecedented number of copies of the single. The song was Hound Dog, and on the B-side was another future classic, Don't Be Cruel. The single was finally released on July 13th, 1956. The result was an explosion. Record stores were mobbed. The single sold over 1 million copies in its first 2 weeks. It would go on to sell over 4 million copies in the United States by the end of the year, making it one of the best-selling singles of all time. It was a sales velocity that the industry had never seen before. The Hound Dog single did not just sell well. It dominated the charts in a way that had never been done. It was the first and only song in history to hit number one on Billboard's pop, country, and western and rhythm and blues charts simultaneously. It stayed at number one on the pop chart for 11 weeks, a record that stood for 36 years. This success rewrote the marketing playbook for the music industry. It proved the immense power of television as a promotional tool. Before Elvis, radio was king. A song became a hit because disc jockeys played it. After the Hound Dog phenomenon, everyone understood that a single high-profile television appearance could be more powerful than months of radio play. It could create an instant hit. This changed the relationship between the music and television industries. Record labels began aggressively trying to get their artists on popular TV shows. Television producers realized that booking a popular musical act could deliver huge ratings. A new synergy was born. The Hound Dog case study showed that you could use television to create a national event around a song release. The controversy was not a liability, it was part of the marketing. The more the adults complained, the more the kids wanted to buy the record. It was the ultimate us versus them product. Owning the Hound Dog single was not just about owning a piece of music. It was about owning a piece of the rebellion they had seen on their television screens. It was a badge of honor. And it was all made possible because millions of people saw a performance before they ever had the chance to buy the record. Television was no longer just a place to see stars, it was the machine that made them. Number 8. Could a white singer bring black music to mainstream TV? The story of Hound Dog did not begin with Elvis Presley. It began in 1952 with a woman named Willie Mae Big Mama Thornton. Thornton was a powerful blues singer. The song was written for her by two young white songwriters, Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller. Her recording of Hound Dog was a massive hit on the rhythm and blues charts in 1953. It was a raw, gritty, and soulful performance. It was unapologetically black music, and in the segregated America of the 1950s, that meant it was music that most white listeners would never hear. It was played on race radio stations, sold in race record stores. It was not played on mainstream pop radio. It would certainly never have been performed on national television by a black woman. When Elvis Presley decided to cover Hound Dog in 1956, he was not covering Big Mama Thornton's version directly. He had seen a Las Vegas act, Freddie Bell and the Bellboys, perform a comedic, up-tempo version of the song. That is the arrangement he adapted. But the roots of the song, its structure, its attitude, were all from the world of R&B. When Elvis performed that song on the Milton Berle Show, he was doing something radical. He was taking a piece of black culture and performing it for a massive, predominantly white national audience. This was a complex and controversial act. On one hand, it can be seen as a classic case of cultural appropriation. For Elvis, a white man became rich and famous from a song that its original black performer saw little financial reward from. Big Mama Thornton reportedly received a single check for $500 for her recording and never saw another dime in royalties. Elvis's success with the song highlighted the deep inequities of the music industry and American society at large. On the other hand, his performance had an undeniable cultural impact. For millions of white teenagers watching television that night, Elvis was their first exposure to the raw energy and rhythms of R&B. He was a bridge. He was taking a sound that was confined to a cultural ghetto and laundering it for mainstream consumption. His whiteness made the music acceptable, or at least visible, to an audience that would have been closed off to the original. The suggestive nature of his performance, which so scandalized white parents, was in many ways a tamer version of the blues traditions he was borrowing from. His television performances of Hound Dog forced a conversation about the origins of this new music called rock and roll. It became clear to anyone paying attention that this was not just a white invention, it was a hybrid, a fusion of country, gospel, and, most importantly, rhythm and blues. By putting this sound on the nation's biggest stage, Elvis, whether intentionally or not, helped to break down some of the rigid musical segregation of the era. He made it acceptable for white kids to listen to music with a black rhythm This in turn opened the door for many black artists like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Fats Domino to cross over and achieve mainstream success. The Hound Dog performance on television was a messy, complicated cultural moment. It was tangled up in issues of race, commerce, and art. But it was undeniably a turning point. It used the most powerful mass medium of the day to inject the DNA of black music directly into the heart of white popular culture. The world of music and the world of television would never be as segregated again. Number 7. What does a TV star look like? In the mid-1950s, you knew what a television star looked like. They looked like your uncle or your friendly neighbor. They were comedians like Milton Berle or Jackie Gleason, men in their 40s, often in tuxedos, telling jokes. You know, they were wholesome, avuncular hosts like Ed Sullivan, who looked more like a mortician than an entertainer. They were sitcom parents like Lucille Ball or Robert Young, relatable and charming. They were, above all, adults. They were safe. They were familiar. The stars of television were part of the establishment. Elvis Presley did not look like any of them. When he appeared on television in 1956, he was 21 years old. He was not an adult in the same way. He was a youth. And he looked the part. There was the hair, the famous pompadour shiny with pomade, with the rebellious sideburns that were not common at the time. There were the clothes. The flashy jackets, the high-collared shirts, the pegged pants. It was a style that was alien to mainstream adult fashion. It was a look that teenagers were starting to emulate, a uniform for a new generation, and then there was his face. On camera, it was a study in contradictions. He had boyish, almost pretty features, but his expression was something else. The curled lip, half sneer, half smile, was a look of defiance. His eyes could be soft and pleading one moment, then hooded and intense the next. He radiated a kind of brooding charisma that was completely new to the television screen. He was not trying to be your friend. He was not trying to make you laugh. He was challenging you. Before Elvis, musical guests on variety shows were often treated as pleasant interludes. They would stand, sing their song nicely, and then leave the stage. The star of the show was the host. But when Elvis performed, he became the center of the universe. The host, the other guests, everything else faded into the background. His physical presence was so commanding, so electric, that it could not be contained. He was not just a singer, he was a visual spectacle. The performance was not just in his voice, it was in his entire body. This created a new template for what a television star, particularly a musical star, could be. It was no longer enough to have a good voice. You had to have a look, you had to have an attitude, you had to have a physical presence that could translate through the small screen. Elvis proved that a television star could be young, rebellious, and a little bit dangerous. He was a new archetype. He was the pop idol. After him, the doors were open for a different kind of star. The Beatles on Ed Sullivan, Michael Jackson on the Motown 25 special, Madonna on the MTV Video Music Awards, where they all owe a debt to the mold that Elvis broke. He showed that a television star did not have to be a safe, comforting figure from the adult world. A television star could be a hero for the young, a symbol of everything new and exciting, and they could look like nothing you had ever seen before. Number 6. Did Milton Berle know what he was doing? Milton Berle was called Mr. Television for a reason. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, his show, Texaco Star Theater, was so popular that it was credited with driving the sale of television sets across America. He was an old-school showman, a product of vaudeville. He knew how to work a crowd. He knew how to build a show. But by 1956, his ratings were starting to slip. Television was changing. New formats and new stars were emerging. Berle, the king of old television, needed something new. He needed something to attract a younger audience. He needed Elvis Presley. The decision to book Elvis was a calculated risk. Berle and his producers knew that Elvis was a rising star with a devoted teenage following. They knew he was generating some controversy, but it is unlikely they understood the scale of the explosion they were about to ignite. Berle's main contribution to the infamous Hound Dog performance was a piece of seemingly innocuous advice. He told Elvis to leave his acoustic guitar backstage. On previous TV appearances, Elvis had always clutched his guitar. It was a bit of a security blanket. It also partially obscured his body. Burl, the vaudevillian, wanted to see the performer. He told Elvis, "Let M see you, son." Did Burl know that this advice would unleash the hip-swiveling, leg-shaking performance that would scandalize a nation? Probably not. He likely thought he was just helping a young performer connect with the audience to put on a better show. In the world of vaudeville, physicality was part of the act. Burl himself was a very physical comedian. He probably saw Elvis's movements as a good gimmick, something that would get people talking. He was a showman who believed that any publicity was good publicity. After the performance and the subsequent media firestorm, Burl's public stance was one of support for Elvis. He defended him against the critics. But he also took credit for what had happened. He boasted that he was the one who had unleashed the real Elvis. He understood that the controversy was good for his show's legacy. It made him seem relevant and edgy. In reality, Burl was a man from an older generation of entertainment trying to understand and capitalize on a new phenomenon. He was not the creator of the phenomenon, but he was the one who gave it its biggest stage. He opened the door and Elvis kicked it down. Burl's role in the Hound dog saga shows the collision of two different eras of entertainment. There was Burl, the master of the rehearsed slapstick world of vaudeville and early television. And there was Elvis, the harbinger of a new, raw, and spontaneous form of performance. Burl thought he was in control. He thought he was showcasing a hot new act on his terms, but the energy Elvis released was too powerful. It could not be contained within the old framework of the variety show. Burl did not know exactly what he was doing, but what he did had permanent consequences. He was the unwitting midwife to the birth of rock and roll television. He lit the fuse, and the explosion changed the landscape forever. Number 5, can controversy be good for business? Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis Presley's manager, was not a music man. He was a carnival barker, a promoter who had managed acts ranging from dancing chickens to country music singers. He did not understand rock and roll, but he understood one thing better than anyone else: how to sell. And when the storm of controversy erupted after the Milton Berle performance, Parker did not see a problem. He saw an opportunity. He saw free advertising while NBC executives were panicking and critics were writing furious columns. Colonel Parker was calmly collecting the newspaper clippings. He understood a fundamental principle of marketing. It is better to be talked about than to be ignored. The negative headlines, the outrage letters, the calls for boycotts, they were all just noise. But it was loud noise. And it was all centered on his client. Every time a newspaper called Elvis vulgar or a menace, they were reinforcing his image as a rebel. And for his target audience, the teenagers of America, rebel was a badge of honor. Parker did not try to extinguish the fire. He fanned the flames. He would leak stories to the press. He would play one media outlet against another. He made sure that Elvis's name stayed in the headlines day after day. He weaponized the generation gap. The more the parents and the establishment hated Elvis, the more the kids loved him. It was a perfect feedback loop of publicity, and it did not cost him a dime. And Parker knew that the people writing the angry letters were not the people who bought records. The people who bought records were the ones who saw Elvis on television and felt a spark of connection. This strategy was on full display in the negotiations for Elvis's television appearances. After the Berle show, Elvis was the most talked about performer in the country. He was also considered the most dangerous. Networks were hesitant to book him, but they also knew he could deliver massive ratings. And Parker used this leverage perfectly. He played the networks against each other. When Steve Allen offered to put Elvis on his show, Parker agreed, even though he knew Allen's plan was to mock his client. Why? Because it kept Elvis on television, it kept the controversy alive, and it resulted in a huge payday. And then he used the success of the Allen show to demand an unprecedented $50,000 from Ed Sullivan, the very man who had said he would never have Elvis on his stage. The entire Hound Dog saga of 1956 was a masterclass in turning controversy into commerce. Parker proved that a moral panic could be a powerful marketing tool. He established a playbook that would be followed by countless pop stars in the decades to come. From the Rolling Stones to Madonna to hip-hop artists, the idea of using controversy to build a brand and sell records became a standard industry practice. It all started with Colonel Parker's cynical but brilliant realization that the outrage of one generation could be translated directly into the currency of the next. He proved that on television, as in the carnival, there is no such thing as bad publicity. Number 4. How did TV change the meaning of a song? The song Hound Dog has had many lives. In its first life, sung by Big Mama Thornton, it was a woman's powerful rebuke to a worthless, cheating man. The Hound Dog was a metaphor for a freeloader. It was a song of defiance and strength, rooted in the blues tradition. When Elvis Presley recorded the song, he used a different set of lyrics. The gender was changed. The meaning became more generic. It was a fun, up-tempo rock and roll song. On the record, it is a great performance. The band is tight. Elvis's voice is full of energy, but the meaning of the song is contained within the sound. It is about what you hear. Then Elvis performed the song on television, and in that moment, the song was transformed. It was no longer just a piece of music. It became a piece of theater. The meaning of Hound Dog was no longer just in the lyrics or the melody. It was in the sneer on Elvis's face, it was in the shake of his leg, it was in the slow, grinding rhythm he adopted for the second half of the performance on the Burrell Show. The visual information became as important, if not more important, than the audio information. Television made the performance the primary text. People were not talking about the song's lyrical content, they were talking about the way Elvis moved. The song became a vehicle for a new kind of physical expression. For his fans, the performance injected the song with a meaning of liberation, freedom, and youthful energy. For his detractors, the performance filled the song with a meaning of vulgarity, rebellion, and a threat to moral order. The song itself was almost incidental. It was the canvas on which this cultural battle was painted. This was a profound change. Before the dominance of television, a song's meaning was created on the radio, on the jukebox, or in a live concert hall. It was a largely auditory experience. Television added a powerful new layer. It made the artist's image, their body, their movements, an inseparable part of the song's identity. You could no longer hear Hound Dog on the radio without picturing Elvis on the screen. The performance on television forever fused the song to his physical image. The Steve Allen performance was another example of this. By having Elvis sing Hound Dog to an actual dog, Allen was attempting to impose a new, literal meaning on the song. He was trying to use the visual context of television to strip the song of its rebellious connotations and make it silly. It was a battle for the song's meaning, fought on the television screen. In the end, this only reinforced the power of the original Burrell performance. The memory of that raw energy was too strong to be erased by a tuxedo and a basset hound. The Hound Dog performances showed that television was not just a passive transmitter of music. It was an active interpreter. It could change the meaning of a song. It could load it with new cultural significance. It established a new reality for musicians. From that point on, how a song looked on television would be a crucial part of its success and its legacy. The music video was still decades away, but the seed was planted on a variety show stage in 1956. The eye had become as important as the ear. Number 3, did TV networks lose control of their own shows? In the early days of television, the networks were in complete control. They were powerful, centralized institutions. They dictated what went on the air. They worked closely with sponsors to ensure that the content was safe, inoffensive, and conducive to selling products. The producers, the hosts, the performers, they all worked within a rigid system of rules and expectations. The network's standards and practices department had the final say on everything from scripts to costumes. The power flowed from the top down. The performance of Hound Dog on the Burrell Show was a moment when that power structure was severely shaken. The backlash to the performance was not just from the public, it was also from within the industry. Sponsors were a crucial part of the television ecosystem. A single company would often sponsor an entire show. These were mainstream, family-oriented brands, like Texaco or Buick. They were horrified by the controversy. They did not want their products associated with something that was being called vulgar and immoral. They put immense pressure on the networks. They threatened to pull their advertising dollars. This was an existential threat to the network's business model. This created a crisis in the executive suites of NBC and its rival CBS. They were caught in a dilemma. On one hand, they had the sponsors and the moral majority demanding that they ban Elvis and performers like him. On the other hand, they had the ratings. Elvis had delivered a huge audience. The youth demographic was tuning in record numbers. This was a new and valuable audience that the networks wanted to capture. They were trapped between their traditional business model and a new, emerging cultural force. The negotiations for Elvis's subsequent appearances on the Steve Allen and Ed Sullivan shows were not just about money. They were about control. Steve Allen's whole tuxedo and dog routine was an attempt by the network to reassert its authority to show that it could control the talent. Ed Sullivan's initial refusal to book Elvis and then his carefully managed presentation of him were part of this same power struggle. The waist-up shot was the ultimate symbol of this. It was the network saying, "We will show you this performer, but we will do it on our terms. We will decide what is acceptable for you to see." But even in this act of censorship, there was a concession. They had to have Elvis on the show. The public demand, driven by the youth audience, was too great to ignore. This showed that the power dynamic was beginning to shift. The networks were no longer the sole arbiters of taste. A new power block was emerging, the star performer and their manager, backed by a massive, loyal fan base. Colonel Parker was able to demand a huge fee for Elvis precisely because the networks needed him more than he needed any single one of them. If one network said no, another would say yes because the ratings were too tempting. The Hound Dog controversy forced the networks to realize that they could not completely control the cultural forces they were broadcasting. They could try to manage them, to censor them, to frame them, but they could not ignore them. The power was beginning to flow from the bottom up, from the audience and the performers, as well as from the top down. The television landscape became a more contested space. The networks were still powerful, but they were no longer absolute monarchs. They had lost their monopoly on control. Number 2, why do we still talk about a performance from 1956? In the long history of television, there have been countless musical performances. Thousands of singers have stood on thousands of stages. Most of them are forgotten. They were moments in time, broadcast once, and then lost to the ether. But Elvis Presley's Hound Dog performances from 1956 are different. They have endured. They have become part of our cultural memory. They are replayed in documentaries. They are referenced in books and movies. They are a historical touchstone. The question is why? Why does this one set of performances still resonate so strongly? Part of the reason is that it was a moment of collision. It was not just a man singing a song. It was the collision of old and new America on the nation's most powerful stage. It was the clash between post-war conformity and a new youth rebellion. It was the sound of black rhythm and blues crashing into the white mainstream. It was the friction between an old controlled medium and a new uncontrollable kind of star. The performance was a flashpoint where all these tensions of 1950s America became visible for a few brief, electrifying minutes. It also created a template for the iconic television moment. Before Elvis, television was mostly about consistency and routine. After Elvis, the idea of a single transcendent television performance that could define a career and a cultural moment was born. The Beatles' first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 follows this template. So does Jimi Hendrix's fiery performance at the Monterey Pop Festival, broadcast on television. So does Michael Jackson's debut of the moonwalk on the Motown 25 special. These are all moments when an artist used the medium of television to create something unforgettable, something that went beyond just a musical performance. The Hound Dog performance was the blueprint. The story of the performance also has all the elements of a great myth. There is the hero Elvis, the villain, the critics and censors, the cynical puppet master Colonel Parker, and the series of trials, the Burl scandal, the Allen humiliation, the Sullivan censorship. The waist-up shot is a perfect, enduring image of this myth. It is a visual metaphor for rebellion against authority. It is a story we understand instinctively, and we continue to retell it because it speaks to a fundamental desire for freedom and self-expression. Finally, we still talk about it because it worked. The performance, the controversy, the whole media circus, it achieved its goal. It made Elvis Presley the biggest star in the world. It sold millions of records. It launched a cultural revolution. It is a story with a clear and dramatic outcome. The performance was not just a footnote in history, it was an engine of history. It did not just reflect a change, it caused one. It demonstrated the power of a new medium and a new kind of music to reshape society. And because we are still living in the world that this performance helped to create, a world of pop idols, media controversies, and generation gaps, the story of Hound Dog on television remains as relevant and powerful as ever. Number one, was it just about the hips? It is easy to reduce the story of Elvis on television in 1956 to a single body part, the hips, the swivel, the gyration. That is what the critics focused on. That is what the censors tried to hide. It has become the shorthand for the entire controversy. But to say it was just about the hips is to miss the point. The hips were the focal point, but they were not the whole story. The threat and the power of Elvis's performance was in the total package. It was in his eyes, the way he would look at the camera with a mixture of innocence and defiance. The way his eyes would close as he felt the music. It created an intimacy, a direct connection with the viewer at home that was both thrilling and, for some, deeply unsettling. It was in his mouth, the famous curled lip, the sneer that was not entirely a sneer. It was an expression of attitude, of a cool detachment that was the very definition of a new kind of rebellion. It was in the sound of his voice, the raw, unpolished energy, the way he would slide between notes, the hiccups and stutters that were a part of his style. It was not the smooth, trained voice of a crooner like Frank Sinatra. It was the sound of the country, of the blues, of something authentic and untamed. It was in his clothes, his hair, his very presence. He was a visual disruption of the clean-cut, conformist ideal of the 1950s. And yes, it was in his body, not just his hips, but the way his whole body responded to the rhythm. The shaking leg, which reportedly started as a nervous tic that he learned to use. The way he would bend his knees, crouch down, and then spring back up. The way he would gesture with his hands. It was a complete physical immersion in the music. He was not just singing the song, he was living it. This was something new for a mainstream audience. Performers were supposed to be controlled, to be masters of their craft. Elvis seemed to be mastered by the music itself. He was a conduit for an energy that was bigger than him. To focus only on the hips is to sanitize the performance, to turn it into a simple caricature of the pelvis. It was much more than that. It was the totality of his being on that stage. It was the fusion of sound, image, and motion. It was the embodiment of a new sensibility. It was class, it was region, it was race, it was youth, all colliding at once. The hips were just the part that the old guard could easily point to and label as vulgar, but what they were really afraid of was everything else. They were afraid of the attitude, the authenticity, the uninhibited joy, and the raw, undeniable power of the whole performance. That is what truly changed television. It was not just a body part, it was a whole new way of being.